Well, hello there, humans, bees, earthlings, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and hope you're lucky enough to be doing it too. I'm Bushka Blitz, and welcome back to another dose of Blitz Justice. Today we're doing a review of the Tier 10 Japanese medium tank, the STB1. If you've just found the channel, there's lots of stuff here, 3 to 4 streams a week, a whole lot of reviews, giggles and antics, so stick around and enjoy yourself. Now, the STB1 was a tank that I really liked on first appraisal, way back in the day when it was released. I thought there were a few duds in the line. The Type 61 and the STA one weren't my kind of, well, they weren't my cup of tea. Didn't really get touchy-feely with them. But they've come a long way. They've really projected well as a line. They have a lot of commonalities all the way through. Gun depression tanks generally have the same kind of characteristics, but the STB1 is the gem of the line for me. It's really the one that stands out and that I really enjoy driving. Now, there's a couple of things going wrong with it though, and I'm going to get to them, but I want to just preface this by saying that this is really a hull-down tank. Like, there's no other way around it. That is where the tank just exceeds expectations for a lot of the time and has a very trollish armor profile. And you're going to see me doing a lot of these kind of things on certain maps. There are certain maps that really lend themselves to this vehicle. Maps where it does exceptionally well and maps where it's not so great. And when you get to those maps where it's not so great, you're going to have to rely on your craft, really, like your ability to keep your head on a swivel, and brawl and peek-a-boom and keep track of multiple people who are doing shots and all those kind of things. But that's the same with any tank. What it does have is one thing you can lay your head on and have a little bit of a snooze and be happy with, and that is the pillow that is gun depression, the ever comfortable and alluring gun depression. Now, I play a lot of gun depression tanks. There's a reason why. Now, gun depression is a oft misunderstood stat. You have 10 degrees of gun depression on this tank. Now, you do have quite a few tanks at tier 10 that have good gun depression. And that's, you know, by no means is this tank a one-off. But of the tanks that have 10 degrees of gun depression, it's kind of got the sexiest turret. It's got this very low, flat-to-the-ground turret. And I'm going to give you a look at it. It looks like a squashed-down Leo turret. In fact, the chassis is a Leo chassis for all intents and purposes. And the turret is just a very cool thing on top. And you can see we're using that 10 degrees of gun depression all the time here. Now, if you are looking at how it would be looking from the other perspective, you can see just how squat the turret is there. Now, it is not a guaranteed don't get pen turret. It's not that kind of turret at all. It's the kind of turret where you sit still, tanks with good penetration numbers like a T110E4 who can get well up into the 300s on its pen, is very capable of penning you. What you're looking at for this tank is the rocking back and forth, moving very gently up a slope, taking a shot and then pulling back, because the area around the gun itself is not a mantlet. It's very much just a pennable bit of the turret. That's the angle you're looking for, that kind of angle there. Even then, it's not a guaranteed bounce. What it is against mediums and heavy tanks who are shooting standard AP rounds is a much higher likelihood of bouncing. And with a turret like that and decent mobility, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, the tank must be overpowered. But it's not, and there's a reason why. Its gun handling is really not that fantastic. I've been driving a lot of FV4202 lately. I really love the FV, and it's come right back for me. It's a brilliant tank, and I also love the Leopard 1. And there are two other gun depression tanks. The FV has 0.29 dispersion buffed up. The Leopard 1 has 0.272 dispersion buffed up. The STB1 at its best, really, unless you're running refined gun, you know, the refined gun, and you're giving up your vertical stabilizer for that, it only has 0.326. Now, it's the same as the M48A1 pattern, but the M48A1 pattern just seems to be a chunkier tank. The STB1 has a whole lot of issues with hitting the target, whereas the FV4202 doesn't, but the FV4202's turret is not the kind of turret that you want to expose to concerted enemy fire. So there's swings and roundabouts, and that's fair enough. You've got to have pros, you've got to have cons. When there are no negatives on a tank, that's when it really is overpowered. Now, I run calibrated shells on pretty much all my tier 10 meds at the moment. The reason for that is quite simple. Heat is important when you come up against tanks like that E100 and you hull down, you don't have a lot of choice to flank. Like, you're in a hull down position. You're holding a line, and you can see how effective it is here. And I'm only really popping a very, very small part of my turret over. Now, something else to remember is that this is the king of view range in tier 10 meds. Indeed, like the view range is massive. You can get it out to 309 meters if you're running a single ration and optics. And the only other tank that can touch you in terms of your view range is the M48A1 Patton. It gets 285. The M60, I guess, if you count that as a proper medium. But it's not a huge, it's not a huge number, because there's a lot of tanks that do have 280, which is only 5 meters less. And it's sleek, like, it looks the goods, and the actual camo is really good. But what you can end up doing, I mean, that shot is crazy, hey, that's a really good one, but it doesn't always work out like that. What you can end up doing with this tank is being in a hull down position, getting pushed on, and if the enemy's aggressive, then what you like to do is have a fallback spot. And that's what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to show you 2 videos in a row where this is how I like to drive the STB1. Like, I'll go to a hull down spot, and then I'll look when they start getting aggressive and pushing. I'll look for another spot to retire to where I get the same kind of gun depression, hull down feel, and I can not be exposed. Because the worst thing to be in an STB1 is in a brawl, because the sides of this tank are abysmal. Like, really, really bad side armor. Your side armor on the STB1 is a whopping 35 millimeters slightly angled. So you're going to get HE pen and HESH pen from all over. Now, you saw there, I moved back, and I'm just trying to get a shot into this. And here I am, I'm absolutely screwed. Like, I'm getting pushed up on. They're going to have a big push there. The rest of our mediums haven't come to this flank, which was really, really odd. They've gone kind of to the middle and the back. So what I'm going to do is push all the way back here and go hull down again. You've got to really think and run into rocks as you do it. Makes life a lot easier. So that's the basics of it, right? You want to be hull down. You can brawl tanks, but you want to brawl tanks that are really big and chunky and slow, or don't have a turret. They're the tanks that you want to be brawling with. You don't want to be stuck in brawls with tanks like Object 140s or T62As, or even FV4202s and the like, because they'll quite often get HESH shots into you. I'm just trying to bust through that. I wasn't trying to hit them intentionally. I just wanted to get through that so I could actually see what was going on back there and aim some shots up. Let's talk about the numbers. Now, I'm not happy with the gun. I don't like the gun. The aim time, however, is another issue. It's got the worst aim time of, you know, the tier 10 meds, basically. That's a bit of a problem. You know, that's all there is to it. It's a bit of a problem. It's not horrible in comparison to all tanks, but to give you some perspective, running a gun lane drive, enhanced gun lane drive, and a vertical stabilizer gets your aim time down to 3.1, right? That sounds pretty reasonable. Running a standard kit out with no gun lane drive, no vertical stabilizer on a T62A will get you to an aim time of 2.6. So that's half a second better than the STB1. If you run the full kit on a T62A, you end up at 2.1, I think, 2.2, which is monumentally better than the STA1. And it's also very, very effective when you're brawling and you're in traverses. The STB1, it just doesn't have the gun lane drive, and that it can't not run those stats. So if you want to improve the accuracy of the tank, you are going to really sacrifice some really important aim time. And you can see, even when you're on song with this tank and you're getting shots off, it doesn't feel as solid and as reliable as an FV4202. And that's because it's not. Its gun handling isn't amazing. It's paying for that really strong turret with a very, very poor, mediocre bunch of gun handling. But at the same time, it's got a proper 10 degrees of gun depression. And there's not a lot you can't do in this game with a tank that has good DPM and 10 degrees of gun depression. Now, back on that DPM front, it does have quite favourable DPM, 3,238 DPM, which is better than the M4801 slightly by like a margin of error that's like 34 damage per minute. So less than 0.2 DPM per second kind of thing. It's crazy. Like, it's not worth noting. But it is 200 DPM better than the FE4202, and then it is better again than the E50M, which is a whole other kettle of fish. Like, that is not a tank that makes a living from damage per minute. And damage per minute is great in a tank that can utilize it, and this is good because the STB1 can run rammer if it wants to and keep that DPM. I would run calibrated shells, but that's just my playstyle. I really like taking advantage of that heat pen. The FV I run calibrated shells on, right? It's got 2,828 DPM, but it's got HESH. So when you put HESH into the equation, your DPM goes berserk. So the STB one doesn't have that ability. So it's a little bit of an in-betweener. It's a tough gig. Something that you do have on the STB one is, you know, a good turret and gun depression and good mobility. So take all that into account and you've got a fairly solid tank. At the same time, its mobility isn't outstanding. Its traverse numbers are reasonable. You've got a big issue though for me with this tank is not the traverse numbers. It's the terrain resistance numbers. So your traverse numbers are 68 degrees per second, basically 68.6 if you're running the improved control, which you can run, and your rations and everything else like that. Where you fall down is in your terrain resistance. You have 1.1 and 1.5 as your 3 terrain resistance numbers. Now, how that works is on hard terrain, your coefficient is 1, on medium terrain, it's 1.1, and on soft, it's 1.5. Those are actually really, really poor for tier 10 meds. You, in fact, have about the same terrain resistance on all but medium. Well, you have exactly the same as the E50M. So you basically got the same mobility as an E50M, which isn't bad for all tanks, but it's fairly poor for a tier 10 medium. And how do I know that? Well, go to blitzstars.com and check out the terrain resistance numbers. The E50M is 1.1, 1.3, and 1.5. The STB one is 1, 1.1, and 1.5. Now, the STB has a slightly better horsepower to weight ratio. So its effective terrain resistance numbers are better than the E50M. And in fact, they're just slightly edged by the M48A1, but at the same time, they're not a touch on the FV4202. They're not a touch on the Leopard 1 or the Object 140 or the T62A. Those tanks leave it for dead in terms of mobility. The FV4202, again, is an unsung hero in terms of mobility. Go and look at the effective horsepower per ton of an FV4202 and prepare for a bit of a surprise. It is right up there with the good boys. But that said, this is how you make the most of this tank. You can see here, I am hull down. I'm looking for targets. I'm resetting my camo. I'm playing intelligently. I'm not pushing on 7 reds that were in town because I can. That E100 there, Miguel Medina, has a really good game. Plays a really solid anchor roll there. He's side scraping down the bottom there off a rock, and he's holding a whole lot of enemy reds while I basically leverage him and the IS-4 on this flank. Iron Curtain, who also has a good game. This is a great example of 3 guys working in unison. I've got the 2 heavies holding either flank, and then I'm basically just farming the damage, resetting camo, and going hull down in the middle. And this is something that the STB1 can do really effectively. And then I'm moving up to try and help this E100 here. I've been conserving my hit points. I'm more than willing to go over here and give him a little bit of a hand. Their PTA is moving around. There's their T30. I'm going to miss this shot on the move on the T30. Yeah, I mean, that's something I find happens a lot with the STB1. Sorry if I called it the STA1. And then I'm moving behind the rock, just trying to keep this PTA. Medina's got him though. Good on you, Medina. And then we're into the E75. Up close and personal, you want to be peak booming. You want to basically be giving these guys a chance, and then we're moving on and leaving this guy alone for Miguel. I've got lots of confidence in him doing the business. He takes out the E75, and then we're into Iron Curtain's target over here. I think the STB one has fallen a little bit behind. There are other tanks I'd rather drive as gun depression tanks. The M48A1, it has about the same gun handling, a little bit better in terms of the aim time, which is important. But where the M48A1 really excels is it's actually got troll as hell armor all over it and is a better brawler. I mean, you can see in these games, I'm still not having a problem putting damage out with the tank. The tank is still very, very successful in putting damage out. It still does the business at all levels in terms of hull down, and it's mobile enough for a tank to actually be counted as a mobile medium. It's not the best mobility at tier 10, but that's like saying it's the lesser among very, very good mobile tanks. Would I rate it? Yeah, it looks hot as hell. It's a very sexy looking tank. It's good for hull down, and I'm actually going to do a full review in the next wee while of hull down tanks at tier 10 among the mediums, and which is the best and why, at just purely going hull down, and which I prefer. But besides that, if I had to pick my favourite medium at the moment, it wouldn't be the STB1, but it fills a very, very solid role. Like most tier 10 tanks, there are no really bad tanks, but there's very, very few mediums I think that you could even conceivably say are bad mediums. I just don't think there are any. I do well in all of them, pretty much. There's not much that they don't fill in terms of a role. They're not really the heavy roles anymore, although the 50M can still fill that one, and I've got a video coming up on that. I just think the STB one's a solid tank. It's fun. Its gun handling leaves me a little bit up in the air, and I'm a really big fan of gun depression tanks with good gun handling, because you then can bring a lot of effective DPM to bear. It's not bad gun handling, but 0.326 at T10 is not really what you consider outstanding. And I mean, amongst all tier 10 meds, it's probably got the worst gun handling. Like, there's nothing else there that really strikes me as... Let me just look at the numbers again. I mean, yeah, it's got the worst gun handling amongst all tier 10 meds. And you can feel that when you drive it if you're used to driving other tier 10 mediums. It's got the highest aim time and the highest dispersion. And those two numbers are pretty much your gun handling. Its on the move rotation numbers are okay. They're middle of the pack. There are two with worse on the move rotation numbers. The 4202 is slightly worse, and the 50M is considerably worse. But there's tanks with a lot better, like the Object 140, and the M60 is the same. Object 140 is obviously better. Look, good tank. Buy it. You won't be unimpressed, but don't be looking for it to be a sharp shooting marksman. That's not its job. It's a good, strong, hull down tank that could hold a choke point in a pinch if it's hull down, and has enough mobility to get around the big boys, but isn't going to be the brawling monster if you're looking for a brawling monster. Make sure to pay attention on the channel. There's a lot more coming. Lots of streams, lots of good content. If you are a patron, remember, these videos go up like 6 to 7 days beforehand, like a week beforehand usually, minimum. So make sure you're looking on the Patreon page. You'll see those videos up well ahead of schedule. Until next time, look after yourselves and stay safe on the battlefield.